All right, before we start to talk today about succession, which is the main thing we're going to talk about, I just want to bring this topic up. So if there's a concept in ecology that when we talk about organisms within an ecosystem, we sometimes talk about their niche. And niche is kind of a hard word sort of to define. We kind of say it's like the role an organism plays in the ecosystem. Sort of like all of the facts about it, such as when it eats, when it's active, what type of food it consumes, what locations, all that information about it make up its niche. So if I were to describe, let's say, a squirrel, I would say a squirrel is active in the deciduous forest. It eats acorns out of white oak trees. It stores acorns throughout the spring and summer, and then eats them during the spring. So all that sort of information about it makes up its niche. And we could also talk about for a species its habitat. Where does it live? What area? And so if we imagine an example where we have a forest, that's the habitat, and in that forest we have a squirrel, like I just described, and we also have a species of chipmunks that also eats acorns out of the white oak trees in the same forest at the same times. If that oak tree produces a limited amount of acorns, what do you think would happen with those two species, the chipmunk and the squirrel? Get them? Yeah, that's what people usually say. They have to fight over who's going to get them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to, like, battle each other, like little chipmunk versus squirrel, head-to-head battle. So they might not be actually fighting with each other, but they would be, we have a word we use, both trying to get the same food that's in a limited quantity. We'd say they would do what with each other? We're getting there.
Square up.
So you're getting close, but no.
Oh, what's that word when it's social? Like.
We would say they would be competing with each other. They would be competing with each other to try to get this limited resources, okay? Usually in an ecosystem, different species can have the same habitat, but usually they do not have the same niche. Because if you do have two species in the same habitat with the same niche, most likely one of them is going to win out. One of them is going to become better adapted, or is better adapted to getting that food, I should say. And what happens to the other?
They die off.
It may die off. What else could this, if the species is going to stay alive, what other things might it do?
Find a new territory.
Kendall?
Migrate.
Migrate, find a new
Ecosystem.
habitat, so change to a different habitat, or stay in the same habitat and change its what?
Food source.
Its niche, right? Start eating a different food source, or something like that. So when organisms share the same niche, that's when competition happens. How many people have a garden at your house? A garden? Okay. Like vegetables, tomatoes. How many people, your parents send you to the backyard to weed the garden?
Nope.
Anyone weed it? All right.
I weed all.
So weeding the garden is an example of some of these things we're just talking about. Who could relate going in the backyard and weeding your garden to what we are just talking about? Natalie?
No, how do you
How could you
relate
relate it? Like, how could you link it to what we're talking about? Not how could you relate it to weeding the garden. Anybody? Like, how does that have to do with niche and habitat? Weeding your garden. Matt?
Where you place the garden?
That's the what? What's that?
That's the habitat.
That's a habitat. And what about niche? Can plants compete with each other?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they can.
Yeah.
They can.
Yeah.
What else? Good, Daddy.
Space for their.
Have sunlight, water, nutrients. All plants need that. So when you have weeds growing in your garden, they have the same habitat as your tomato plants, and also the same niche. And what are they doing with your tomato plants? Competing with them. By you removing those weeds, you're limiting competition so that your tomato plants or lettuce or peas can get as much of those resources as possible, so they get as much light, nutrients, water as possible. And so when you weed your garden, you're eliminating competition. Okay? So that your tomato plants are the only plants that have that niche in your habitat of the garden. Okay, so the last thing to talk about today is succession. Succession is a slow, usually gradual change in an ecosystem over a period of time. Usually we talk about succession as it happens after some kind of disturbance. Like when we talked about in our question of the day, a bulldozer destroying the forest, that starts over this process of succession. And as you all told me, that bare soil wouldn't just stay bare soil for 10 years. It would start to change. Things would start to grow. Different plants and animals would come into the ecosystem. That process, when it changes over time, is called succession. Basically, one community replaces another, which replaces another, until we get to sort of a stable ecosystem. What we'll talk about in a minute. So, you think about that forest that got bulldozed. The same year that it gets bulldozed, what type of plants do you think you would find there? Obviously, you wouldn't have full-grown trees, right? But what might you start? What are the very first things that you might find?
Wow.
Nick?
Like, oh, you mean like types of plants?
Yeah.
I was gonna say like decomposers.
Maybe there will probably be decomposers. What else? Nate? Dandelions? Yeah. What? Yes. Haley? Grasses? Small, just like fast-growing plants like dandelions, other weeds, grass, because that stuff can get there and grow very quickly within a few days. All right, and that would happen that same year. But as the years go by, what else starts to come into the ecosystem and start growing? Some new animals would start to come in. You know, if it's just grass, at that point you probably have like mice and small animals. What happens to the plants as time's going along, Kendall?
They grow bigger and become like trees.
We get larger plants. We start to get woody plants, shrubs, certain types of fast-growing trees. And as time continues to go by, so maybe after 10 years we have woody shrubs and some small, fast-growing trees. What about 75 years later? Yeah, a larger forest, probably bigger trees, obviously, larger animals. And eventually, you would get back to a stage where we're back to sort of the original forest that we started with before the bulldozer. We have some terms for that. So the first species that could start to sort of colonize and grow in an area, we call them the pioneer community. Where have you guys seen that word pioneer before? Social studies. Who were the pioneers in social studies that you learned about? What? James? The first Europeans moving west, right? Into new parts of North America that Europeans had not been in before. Okay, so they were the pioneers. Pioneers are the organisms that come in to this disturbed area and can start to grow quickly. Usually it's small plants and animals and things. You could even have pioneer organisms that can grow on bare rock. What can grow on bare rock? Moss. Any of you know what lichen is?
No.
It's like scaly stuff. It grows on trees and on rocks. It's grayish sometimes or green. Yeah, those are like the first things that can start to grow in the ecosystem. You can go from just completely bare rock to an ecosystem over a long period of time. Because as the moss and lichens start to die, they start to form a thin layer of soil that plants can then come into. And then as those plants live and die and decompose, the soil gets thicker, eventually becoming thick enough to allow larger plants. The climax community is a term for like the end stage of succession, the mature ecosystem that forms. Sort of like the end point of succession. And that varies by where you are, where this ecosystem is located. In our area, what's the climax community? If you left your backyard and you never mowed it again, or the field that got bulldozed, or a farmer doesn't plant his crops, just lets his field set. All of those ecosystems around us will eventually form what? A forest. The climax community around here is a forest, usually a hardwood forest, beech, birch, maple trees. But that varies depending on where you're located. Like if you go up into the Adirondacks with a colder climate or up on mountains, you don't get the same types of forest. Do you know what type of forest you find at higher elevations?
Like
Pines, conifers, evergreens, spruces, firs. If you go to the Midwest of the United States, the climax community is not a forest. It's a prairie, a grassland. If you go to the Southwest United States, climax community might be a desert. If you go down to the tropics, the climax community might be a tropical rainforest. If you go up north, it might be a tundra. So it depends on all of the conditions will determine ultimately what that climax community is. And it's stable. But even if it's stable, does that mean in a mature forest the trees live forever? No, trees don't live forever. Trees have a lifespan. But in a climax community, when trees die off, they're usually replaced with similar species, so it stays stable. Yeah?
Like say there's something in bulldozer, but instead of that there was like a wildfire. Couldn't there still be like, couldn't stuff still grow in that kind of area?
Yeah. So it may not completely destroy the eco, so there's still these species.
Like stuff underneath the ground, like the old seed.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that today. And I will talk about that in a minute. So, as an example, here's a diagram shows kind of the pioneer to climax community. And again, you might have these small, simple organisms, lichens, mosses, which get replaced by grasses and herbs and shrubs and small, quick-growing trees, which get replaced by larger trees, which get replaced by more mature trees. And so that would be an example of succession taking place. It even happens sometimes in like a pond ecosystem. Does anyone have a pond near their house or a friend or what exactly is a pond on someone's property?
a ditch with water.
Yeah, basically it is, because usually ponds are man-made. Somebody dug it out at some point in the past. It's filled with water. You ever went swimming in a pond?
Yeah.
What's the bottom like? All mucky? What is that? That stuff like you don't even want to step on sometimes? Often it's decaying plants that died and they sink to the bottom. Over a long period of time, the depth of the pond, what happens to it?
Decreases.
Decreases. It gets shallower and shallower. Because as the plants in there die and decompose, they add sediment to the pond. And that starts to build up. And then you can get more plants and it starts to build up. If you leave a pond, a man-made pond, over time, it will eventually fill in with all that sediment and become a land-based ecosystem. If you know anyone with a pond, you may know they have to have it sometimes excavated. They dig out that sediment if they want to keep the pond a certain depth and get rid of it or pump it out, something like that. So Natalie brought up fire before. I know you guys are going to complain because you spent so long on Firestorm last year. But fire is really interesting in the forest. Some forests of the United States and of the world are adapted to regular fire. Some trees, some types of pines, have special cones, serotinous cones, that are almost completely glued together. The seeds are inside. And they only open up when a fire has gone through, melting that resin, allowing the pine cone to open up and release its seeds. That's an adaptation that type of tree has to regular fires and allows the species to continue even if a fire has went through the forest. And you see this, the picture on the left shows right after a forest fire. You got all the charred trees, nothing on the soil, all been burnt up. And then you look a year later and you see lots of new growth coming in. This fire has sort of restarted the process of succession, and we would expect this ecosystem to eventually reach a climax community of mature trees there. So I know you guys study this.